The bridge tilted, and Vithkal's claws found the railing too late. Sparks fell from the ceiling in slow arcs, catching the dark like something almost beautiful, if beauty had ever mattered less. Somewhere below him a bulkhead screamed as it buckled, and the smell of scorched wiring replaced the ceremonial oils he'd worn since dawn. He had commanded this ship for 19 years. He had felt it groan under weapons fire before, felt it shudder through 100 lesser battles against 100 lesser worlds. He had never felt it shake like this. The tactical display did not flicker the way a damaged system should. It did not stutter, did not spike, did not do any of the things a dying network does when it panics and starts lying to itself about what it can still see. It simply counted down, clean and even, like something running a script it had rehearsed 1,000 times before anyone on this bridge had been born. 96 systems had bowed to the Valkyrie banner without this. Terra was supposed to be the 97th, a formality, a signature at the bottom of a scroll nobody would ever bother to read twice. Now the number on the display kept falling, and nothing about the way it fell made any sense at all. No cannon fire lit the black outside the viewport. No boarding call sounded over the comm. No warning came at any point, only the number, dropping, steady as a heartbeat that wasn't his. Commander Sarth's voice cracked through the chaos, half swallowed by a fresh burst of static. "Hi, Marshal. I can't raise the forward line." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Vithkal watched the number fall again and understood in the cold part of his mind that had conquered 58 worlds and buried every doubt that had ever tried to slow him down, that he did not understand this at all. Not the shape of it, not the silence around it, not the terrible patience it implied. Somewhere behind him, a junior officer was praying to a god the Empire had stopped teaching children to name 3,000 years ago. Vithkal didn't turn to see who. He kept his eyes on the number, because the number at least was still telling him the truth. I wish I could tell you it ended there, in that first minute of noise and sparks and a countdown no one could explain. It didn't. Stay close. The quiet part comes after. 12 days earlier, the Hammer of Eternity had not yet crossed into the Valoris system. Vithkal stood on the observation deck as the ship dropped out of the long dark, and the system's cold white star swelled ahead of them like an eye-opening after a very long sleep. He straightened the cuff of his ceremonial coat, a small ordinary habit, one he performed before every arrival, whether the world below was worth the gesture or not. This one, by every report stacked on his desk, was not. Category 6 Death World, Commander Sarth read aloud from the tactical brief, not bothering to look up from the console. Sarth was 89 years old, built low and broad the way the older military families were bred, with a voice that had gone flat and practical somewhere around his 40th conquest. Primitive. No orbital defense signatures detected. No response to the standard hail on any of the 17 frequencies we've tried. Then they'll respond to the fleet. Vithkal's clawed fingers tapped once against his thigh. Atmosphere hostile to unmodified Valkyrie physiology. An old tell from a scar he'd earned 58 years ago on his very first conquest and never quite let heal the way it should have. The mark ran from his left brow down through the socket, a thin, pale seam against bronze scales, and he'd worn it since as something closer to a medal than a wound. Send the ultimatum. 12 of their minutes. Standard terms. Full surrender or full correction. Full correction has a 91% historical success rate on Category 6 worlds. Sarth offered in the tone of a man reciting something he'd said so many times it had stopped meaning anything. They tend to fold before we finish the first orbital pass. They always fold. Vithkal said it without pride, the way another man might note that water was wet. Behind him, an old voice cleared itself, uninvited. Archivist Thalvith stood in the doorway, his scarred hands folded into the sleeves of a robe the faded gray of a scholar who had spent 4 centuries reading things nobody else wanted to read anymore. He was small next to the others on this bridge, stooped in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the weight of everything he'd cataloged in that time. Hi, Marshal. Before the fleet enters the system, I would ask you to review the survey record. I've read the survey record, Archivist. I read it before you were assigned to this vessel. Then you'll recall that 3 expeditions were lost here. Thalvith's voice didn't rise. It rarely did, even when it should have. 512 years ago, 3 ships, 31 crew between them. The logs were sealed within a week of the disappearance. The sector maps were marked incomplete and never corrected. In 4 centuries of archival work, High Marshal, I have never once seen a sector left incomplete by accident. 3 ships, 500 years ago. Vithkal didn't turn around. The star kept growing in the viewport, patient and indifferent. You see ghosts in every nebula, Archivist. It's why they keep you in the vault and not on a bridge. I see a pattern no one has ever explained. Thalvith folded his hands tighter. That is not the same thing as a ghost, High Marshal. The fleet moved forward, and the star kept growing, and the old archivist stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the back of a man who would not turn around, before he finally left without another word, a small thing, easy to miss. A ghost is a story people tell to close a question. What I have is a question no one has been permitted to ask. Vithkal said nothing to that. He had learned, across 58 conquests, that silence from a superior did more work than argument ever could. The kind of thing a man only remembers later, when it is far too late for the remembering to matter. Sarth waited until the door had closed before he spoke again, quieter now. Should I log the objection? High Marshal? Log it. Vithkal allowed himself something close to a smile. Thalvith logs an objection on every world we've ever taken. It gives him something to do between conquests. It has never once been right. Understood, sir. Sarth didn't smile back. Sarth had served under 3 high marshals and buried 2 of them, and had learned a long time ago that the safest place to keep an opinion was nowhere at all. 220 meters beneath a mountain ranged the humans called the Andes. The air smelled of recycled oxygen, cold coffee, and the low electric hum of machines that had been humming, without complaint, for longer than most of the people walking past them had been alive. Admiral Grayson Hart sat with a paper book open on his knee and a dented tin cup of tea gone cold beside his hand. He had carried that cup since his first posting 30 years ago, through 2 promotions and 1 divorce, and a funeral he still didn't like to think about. He didn't remember exactly why he'd kept it anymore. He only knew he'd feel wrong drinking from anything else, the way some men feel wrong without a wedding ring long after the marriage that gave it meaning is over. The ultimatum came through at 0347 hours, translated into flat, careful English by a system that had been waiting for exactly this kind of message for 104 years. Hart read it once. He set the tablet down beside the cup, and for a moment the command center was quiet enough that the hum of the old relays seemed louder than it had any right to be. He didn't answer it. Lieutenant Jace Morrell, 3 consoles over, watched the fleet's signature bloom across the outer display like a bruise spreading under skin, and let out a low whistle. He was 26, new enough to the grid that the numbers still impressed him more than they frightened him. That's a lot of ships for one death world, sir. You want me to run a fresh count? Focus, Jace, murmured Captain Lena Okonkwo, without looking away from her own screen, though her jaw had gone tight the way it always did, when the numbers on it got too large to be comfortable. She was the grid commander, 41 years old, and she had run drills against a fleet exactly this size more times than she could count on paper. In simulation, in the small hours of nights she didn't tell her husband about, none of the drills had ever felt like this. I've counted them twice already, Hart said. Without looking up from the book he was no longer reading. 1943, give or take whatever they're hiding in the aft formation. Morrell blinked. You already had the number, sir. I've had the number for 30 years, Lieutenant. I just never expected to need it before I retired. Okonkwo allowed herself the smallest exhale, not quite a laugh. Hart closed the book. He'd known this day was coming since before he was born, since his father stood watch over an empty sector of stars and wrote down, in careful long hand, in a journal Hart still kept in the drawer of his desk, that something out here had been waiting for something else. He didn't need to check the display to know what it showed, and that whatever it was, it would not announce itself twice. The Stillwater Protocol was a bureaucratic footnote buried in 47 classified appendices, cross-referenced under a Defense Authorization Act that had been renewed, without debate, by 11 different administrations who mostly didn't know what they were renewing. Most days, Hart didn't even think about it. Today, he thought about nothing else. Grid status, he said. All nodes report green. Okonkwo's fingers moved across the panel, calling up a wall of steady light, row after row after row. Every relay, every mine. 104 years of maintenance, sir, and not one of them has ever fired a shot in anger. Not once in 104 years. They won't fire in anger today either. Hart picked the cup back up, drank the cold tea without any expression at all, the way he did most things. They'll fire because I tell them to. That's the only difference that's ever mattered. Morrell, still watching the fleet signature crawl across his screen, asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the alert first sounded. Sir, can I ask what we're actually looking at? I've read the briefing packet twice, and it still doesn't say much. You're looking at an empire that has never lost a war, Hart said. 96 systems, 14,200 years of unbroken conquest. They've never had to learn what losing sounds like. He set the cup down. We're about to teach them. On a wall no one in that room had looked at in months, a small brass plate caught the overhead light. It read nothing more than a date and a name, his father's, and beneath it, in smaller letters worn soft by decades of dust and cleaning cloths, 3 words that had outlived every officer who'd ever walked past them without reading them twice. We were warned. Somewhere above, in the dark between the stars, the Valkyrie fleet crossed the outer marker of a system its own survey teams had once entered and never left. No alarm sounded on their side. No sensor flagged the debris field drifting along their approach vector. Wreckage half buried in ice for 5 centuries, stripped clean of anything worth salvaging a very long time ago by hands that had known exactly what they were looking for. Sarth's console blinked once. A small yellow warning easy to dismiss, and he dismissed it, the way he'd dismissed 1,000 small yellow warnings across 89 years of service, because in 89 years, not one of them had ever mattered. Hart, 220 meters underground, opened a private channel to no one in particular and said only, "Wake them up." And somewhere in the dark, systems that had waited 104 years for a single sentence began, very quietly, to listen. Okonkwo watched her console shift from a wall of steady green light to something else entirely, a slow bloom of readiness, node by node, spreading outward from the bastion like roots finding water after a long drought. She had trained for this moment for 11 years. She had never once believed she would live to see it happen for real. "Talk to me, Captain," Hart said. "Nodes coming online across the belt, sir. Sequence is clean. No faults." She glanced at him. Just once. "It's beautiful, actually." "I never expected it to be beautiful." "It's not beautiful," Hart said. "Not unkindly. It's overdue." Above them, unseen, unheard, the fleet kept coming, confident in the silence of a world it had already decided didn't know how to speak. The 12 minutes ran out at 0359. Vithkal watched the counter reach 0 on the ultimatum display and felt nothing close to surprise. Silence was the answer he'd expected from the start, the answer every Category 6 world gave, right up until the moment the fleet arrived close enough to make silence a very bad strategy. No response, Sarth confirmed, unnecessary but procedural. "As predicted. They're panicking," Vethkal said, "or they're primitive enough to think we're bluffing. Either way, it ends the same." He turned from the viewport, coat still perfectly straight. "Proceed to orbit. Standard interdiction pattern." The fleet moved. 1,000,000 kilometers. 800,000. 600,000, the numbers falling the way. Numbers always fell before a conquest, steady and unremarkable. The countdown of a thing that had happened 58 times before and would, everyone on that bridge assumed, happen a 59th. Sarth's console flashed yellow again. This time he didn't dismiss it. "High Marshal." He leaned closer to the display, and something in his voice had changed, the flatness gone out of it. "I'm reading energy signatures. Distributed. Low output, but they're everywhere across the belt. Signature analysis. Unknown, sir? Running comparison now." A pause, longer than Sarth's pauses ever were. "Nothing in the Imperial database matches the profile. They don't read as weapons. They don't read as anything." Vithkal crossed to the display himself. The first time in this approach he'd bothered to look at raw data instead of a summary someone else had already decided was safe to hand him. The readings spread across the asteroid belt like a rash, faint and patient. Thousands of small points of power drawing almost nothing, waiting for almost nothing, doing almost nothing that any sensor built to detect weapons had ever been trained to see. "Could be mineral deposits," Sarth offered. "Some kind of magnetic anomaly. The system has a strange geological history." "Could be," Vethkal said, and did not believe it, and gave the order to proceed anyway, because 58 conquests had taught him that hesitation in front of a fleet cost more than almost any risk he could name. 220 meters below the Andes, Okonkwo watched the same numbers from the other direction and allowed herself, for the first time since the alert sounded, something close to a smile. "They're inside the outer ring, sir. Their scans are picking up the nodes. Reading them as geological." "Good," Hart said. "Let them believe that as long as they can." Morel glanced over from his console, and there was something almost boyish in the way he asked it, the question he'd clearly been sitting on since the fleet first crossed the marker. "Sir, can I ask the debris field out past the belt? That's not natural, is it? I ran a materials scan on it last year during a routine sweep and half the readings didn't match anything in the registry." "No," Hart said. "It's not natural." "What is it?" Hart didn't answer right away. He looked instead at the small brass plate on the far wall, the one with his father's name on it, the one nobody in this room but him ever really read. 512 years ago, he said finally, 3 Valkyrie survey ships came through this system looking for exactly what their fleet is looking for now. They didn't find a death world. They found us early enough and quiet enough that we had a choice nobody else in this galaxy has ever gotten. Announce ourselves to an empire that had never lost a war. He set the tin cup down. Or take their ships apart, quietly, and build something out of the pieces, and wait. Morrel's jaw worked for a second before anything came out. For 104 years. For as long as it took. Hart's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. My father made that choice. I'm the one who gets to finish it. Okonkwo hadn't looked away from her console the entire time, but her hands had gone still. Sir, the lead elements are entering the interdiction zone. Formations tightening. They're settling into orbital approach. Let them settle. Hart picked the book back up, opened it to the page he'd marked, and did not read a single word of it. Grid status. All nodes still reading green. All minds still silent. They have no idea we're here. She hesitated. It's strange, sir. Watching something this big walk into something this quiet. That's the whole design, Captain. He closed the book again. An empire that's never lost doesn't know how to look for silence. They only know how to look for noise. On the hammer of eternity, Thalvith found his way back to the observation deck without being summoned, which was, in itself, a small act of defiance he'd rehearsed the whole walk over. Hi, Marshal. A moment. I've given you your moment, Archivist. Twice, in fact. The energy signatures Commander Sarth logged as geological. Thalvith held up a data slate, hands trembling only slightly, the way they'd trembled for the last decade of his 4 centuries. I cross-referenced them against the survey logs from 500 years ago. The distribution pattern is nearly identical to the last transmission we received from the Lost Expedition before the logs went silent. Vithkal didn't turn. You've been busy. I have had 500 years to be busy, High Marshal, and no one has ever once asked me what I found. Thalvith's voice cracked on the last word, not from age, but from something closer to grief for a warning nobody had ever let him finish giving. 1,943 ships, and you want me to withdraw them from an unarmed death world because of an old man's pattern matching. I want you to withdraw them because the last time this pattern appeared, I am asking you now, formally, to withdraw the fleet from the interdiction zone until this pattern can be properly understood. Withdraw. Vithkal said the word like it tasted wrong in his mouth. 3 ships and 31 crew disappeared and were never explained. Thalvith held his ground, small and stooped and entirely unmoved. I do not know what waits in that belt, High Marshal. I only know that something does, and that it has been very patient. And patience of that length is not the behavior of a primitive world. Vithkal's claws tapped once against his thigh. For a moment, one single moment, brief enough that no one on the bridge would later be certain they'd seen it at all. Something in his expression shifted, the smallest crack in 58 years of certainty. Then it closed. Logged the objection, Archivist. Same as always. He turned back to the viewport where the pale curve of the world called Terra had begun to fill the glass, blue and white, and entirely deceptively still. This conversation is finished. Thalvith didn't move for a long moment. Then he bowed, the old formal bow that had gone out of fashion 2 centuries ago, and left the bridge the same way he'd entered it, quietly and unheard. In the bastion, Hart set the book down for good. Talk to me, Captain. They're in full orbital position, sir. Lead cruisers holding at the outer marker. Main formation settling in behind. Okonkwo's voice had gone very steady, the particular steadiness of someone who had trained her whole career for a single moment and could feel it arriving. They're not moving to strike yet. They look like they're waiting for something. A final signal, maybe, or just settling in, like they think they have all the time in the world. They do, Hart said. Right up until they don't. He rose from his chair for the first time in nearly an hour, walked the short distance to the brass plate on the wall, and rested 2 fingers against it, briefly, the way he did every year on the same date, and never told anyone about. No fear, no ceremony. Just 104 years of waiting folded down into the space of a single ordinary gesture. Sequence status, he said, not turning around. All 1,806 nodes report ready. Standing by on your order. Behind Hart, on the main display, the Valkyrie fleet hung suspended over a world it believed had nothing left to teach it. 1,943 ships, arrayed in the same confident formation that had ended 96 wars before this one. All 6,700 minds report armed and silent. Okonkwo's hand hovered over the interface, not yet touching it. We are green across the board, Admiral. Full grid, holding perfectly still in the dark, entirely unaware that the dark itself had already learned their names. Fire, Hart said. Okonkwo's hand came down on the interface without hesitation, without ceremony, the same steady motion she'd rehearsed alone in this room 100 times when no one was watching. Stillwater active. All nodes report ready? Firing above the world called Terra, the dark that had learned the fleet's names finally spoke. On the hammer of eternity, Sarth's console didn't blink yellow this time. It went white, then red, then a color the Imperial database had no name for, and his voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the flatness he'd worn like armor for 89 years. "Hi, Marshal, we're taking fire. Multiple sources. I can't localize the origin. Where, Vithkal was already moving toward the display, claws digging into the railing hard enough to score the metal. Everywhere, Sarth's hands shook over the console. The belt, the moons, debris we logged as inert. "It's high, Marshal. The signatures we scanned as geological. They weren't geological, they were powered down. They've been powered down this entire time. Waiting for a Cruiser 3 formations out went silent on the display, then vanished from it entirely. Not damaged, not disabled, simply gone, the way a word disappears when you stop saying it. Then another, then two more, close enough together that the sound of their deaths reached the bridge as one long overlapping scream of static before the comm cut out entirely. They were waiting for us," Sarth said, quieter now, the words falling out of him like something he hadn't meant to say aloud. "They knew we were coming. They've known for longer than we've been an empire." Below, in the bastion, Morel watched the tactical feed with his mouth slightly open, the boyish excitement from an hour ago gone, replaced by something that looked almost like awe. "First volley complete," Okonkwo reported, and her voice, too, had changed, not triumphant, not cold, just very, very steady, the voice of someone doing a job she'd promised herself she would do without flinching. A third of their forward formation gone in just over 3 seconds. Hart didn't sit back down. He stood with both hands loose at his sides, watching the display the way a man watches weather he has been forecasting his entire adult life. "Second volley," he said. "Don't wait for them to reorganize." Second volley firing. A pause. Longer this time, filled with the low hum of 104 years of patience finally spending itself. "Second volley complete. They're trying to retreat, sir. Formation's broken. They don't know which direction is safe. There isn't one." Hart's voice stayed level. Third volley. On the hammer of eternity, Vithkal grabbed the command console with both hands as the ship rolled hard beneath him, alarms layering over alarms until the individual sounds blurred into a single wall of noise. Half his forward fleet had simply stopped existing in the time it took to draw 3 breaths. He had commanded conquests that lasted years. He had never once imagined losing this many ships before he'd finished issuing his first order of the day. "Pull back," he said, and heard, for the first time in 58 years, something in his own voice that sounded almost like the archivist's. "All ships, full retreat, minimum safe. They can't retreat, High Marshal." Sarth's console showed the answer before he could speak it. The perimeter sealed. Something detonated behind the trailing formation. "We're boxed in, 6,700 mines, laid across 5 decades of quiet nights, by people who never expected to see them used, closed around the remaining fleet like a hand finally deciding to make a fist." In the moment before the third volley landed, Thalvith appeared in the doorway of the bridge again, unsummoned, uninvited, and for the first time in this entire crossing, he did not speak of warnings or logs or patterns. He simply looked at Vethkal, and Vethkal, gripping the railing with both hands, looked back at him, and neither of them said anything at all. It was the only conversation the two men would ever finish. "Third volley complete," Okonkwo said. "Sir, that's the majority of their combat strength. What's left is scattered, disabled, or drifting." Hart nodded once. He reached for the tin cup out of habit, found it empty, and set it back down without drinking. "Hold the grid," he said. "Let the ones still moving keep moving. There's nowhere left for them to go." For a moment, one full, aching moment, nobody in the bastion spoke. The hum of the old relays filled the silence the way it always had, patient and unbothered, exactly as it had for 104 years, while everyone around it assumed it would never be needed. Then Morel, very quietly, said the thing none of them had let themselves say out loud yet. "We just beat an empire, sir. We just answered one." Hart didn't look at him. "There's a difference. Ask me again in an hour." On the Valkyrie flagship, the lights failed in stages, section by section, the bridge going from white to red to a dim emergency amber that made every face on it look already halfway to a ghost. Sarth's console, the last one still fully functioning, showed a number that had once read 1943, and now showed something far smaller, and was still falling. Vithkal watched it fall and thought, absurdly, of Thalvith standing in every doorway he'd ever walked through on this ship, saying the same quiet thing in 100 different ways, and no one, least of all himself, had ever once let him finish. "Signal from the surface. Sarth said, his voice gone hollow. They're hailing us. Vithkal straightened his coat. The same small gesture he'd made 12 days ago, arriving in this system for the first time, certain of exactly what would happen next. Open it! 220 meters below the Andes. Hart looked at the open channel for a long moment before he spoke into it, and when he did, his voice carried none of the weight the moment seemed to demand, only the flat. His hands this time were not entirely steady, tired calm of a man finishing a job that had outlived his father. High Marshal Vithkal, he said. This is Admiral Hart. He let the silence sit there, long enough that on the far end of the channel, a bridge full of dying men and women could hear exactly how little urgency was in it. Your fleet is gone, Hart said. There is nothing left to transmit. The channel stayed open a moment longer, filling with nothing but static and the distant sound of a ship's systems failing one deck at a time. Vithkal did not answer. Grid status, he said, to no one in particular, and Okonkwo, still watching the last scattered signatures drift and die across her display, didn't answer right away either, because for the first time in 104 years, there was, by then, very little left on that bridge capable of answering anything. Hart reached out and closed the connection himself. There was nothing left on that screen that needed watching. No answer came. Okonkwo let the silence sit a moment longer before she finally spoke. Sir, confirmed. Their command signal's gone dark across the board. Whatever's left of that fleet isn't going anywhere. Then we're not either. Not yet. Hart reached for the tin cup, found it still empty, and set it down without seeming to notice. It was such a small thing that reaching, the same motion he'd made 1,000 times before this morning, and would make 1,000 times after that, no one in the room thought to remark on it. It was only later, much later, that Morel would remember it and understand what it meant. No ceremony marked the moment. No alarm sounded the all clear. The bastion simply kept humming, the way it always had, the way it would keep humming long after everyone currently standing in it was gone. They came for a death world, Hart said quietly, to no one and everyone. They found a promise instead. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. We were warned. We were patient. We were right. On the hammer of eternity, what remained of the bridge crew stood in the dark, waiting for orders that would not come, because the man who should have given them no longer had a voice left to give them with. Vithkal stood at the shattered railing and stared out at a field of wreckage that had, 12 days ago, been the largest expedition his empire had sent anywhere in 200 years. He did not weep. He did not rage. He simply stood, the ceremonial scar along his eye socket catching the dying emergency light, and understood, at last, the thing Thalvith had spent 500 years trying to make him understand, that some silences are not empty. Some are simply waiting for you to finish crossing them. Far across the system, in the vault of echoes buried deep within a station no longer capable of retreat, Thalvith sat alone among 4 centuries of records that had, until this hour, never once been believed. He held the data slate that had logged his warning, 30 years old now, dated and stamped and dismissed, and for the first time since he had entered the archivist's service as a young man, he allowed himself to weep not for the fleet, and not even for Vithkal. He did not celebrate, but for every version of himself across 5 centuries who had said the same true thing into rooms that refused to hear it. Weeks passed before the Obsidian Throne spoke at all. When Emperor Vraxan finally addressed the Empire, it was not with a declaration of war. It was a single sentence, transmitted once, to every system under his banner. The Death World designation for the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star was permanently revoked. No system in 96 had ever earned that kind of silence from the throne before. None would again. 220 meters beneath the Andes, the bastion had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet after a storm, not empty, just spent. Morel sat back from his console for the first time in hours, hands trembling slightly, now that there was nothing left urgent enough to steady them for. Sir, he said, 1,943 ships. And it took. He stopped, searching for the number, and didn't find one that felt big enough to hold what had happened. It took less time than this conversation. That's the whole point of 104 years, Lieutenant. Hart rose from his chair at last, slow, the way a man rises after sitting still through something enormous. You don't spend it to be fast. You spend it so that when the moment comes, fast is all it has to be. No warning, no declaration, no mercy the Empire had ever offered anyone else, returned in kind. He crossed to the wall where the brass plate caught the light, and for a long moment he simply stood in front of it, the way his father must have stood in front of some other wall, some other silence, waiting for a war that never came in his own lifetime. Hart reached into his coat and drew out a pocket watch, old and scratched. the crystal face gone slightly cloudy with age. It had stopped running years before he was born. He had never once had it fixed. He never got to see this, Hart said, to the plate or to the watch or to no one at all. No, sir, Okonkwo said gently, but he built the reason it happened. Hart closed his hand around the watch and said nothing else for a while. It was Morel, still turning the number over in his head like a coin he couldn't stop flipping, who finally asked the question that had been sitting under everything since the first volley fired. Sir, the Stillwater Protocol. All this time it was just a line item. 47 appendices deep. Nobody ever even talked about it. That was the design. Hart slid the watch back into his coat. A line item doesn't attract questions. A weapon does, so it wasn't really a footnote at all. No. Hart looked, for just a moment, almost like a much younger man, the one who'd first read his father's journal at 17 and hadn't understood a word of it until decades later. It was never the footnote. The Empire just never read far enough to find out. Okonkwo watched the last of the tactical display fade to standby, the grid settling back into the same dormant patience it had held for 104 years, ready now for a war that everyone in that room hoped. It was the entire sentence, without quite saying it aloud, would never come again. What happens now, sir? She asked. To them, to us. Hart considered the question longer than any other he'd been asked that day. Now, he said, we find out if an empire that's never lost knows how to learn from it. And if they don't, he glanced once more at the brass plate, at the 3 words worn soft by decades of hands that had touched it without meaning to will still be here, same as always. We've had 104 years of practice. He walked past the darkened tactical wall, past consoles gone quiet, past the small brass plate that had watched over this room longer than anyone currently standing in it had been alive. Waiting isn't hard, Captain, and paused at the door only long enough to look back once at the empty command chair. The closed book resting on its arm, the tin cup sitting beside it, dented and cold and entirely ordinarily still. He did not say anything more. He turned off the light behind him, and the hum of the old relays kept going in the dark, the way it always had, the way it would for as long as anyone needed it to.